take it away.
All right, welcome everybody. Wonderful to see such a big turnout. I am excited for today's presentations, and I'm hoping you are too. This is going to be the CoSMoS Coastal Groundwater Hazards with Rising Seas in Puget Sound virtual workshop. If you haven't had a chance to share your name and affiliation in the chat yet, please do so. And really glad you're here today. So we are your hosts. I'm Rebecca Rothwell. I work at the Department of Ecology. I'm a shoreline planner and the co-coordinator of the Anyway, I am the co-coordinator for the Shoreline Coastal Planners Group, along with Sydney Fishman, who works for the Washington Sea Grant as a coastal management specialist.
Hi, everyone.
The Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group is a collaborative project of the Washington Sea Grant and Washington State Department of Ecology. We're an educational group of coastal planners working for the federal, state, local, and tribal governments, nonprofits, conservation districts, and private consultants. We represent a multidisciplinary group of individuals.
Thank you so much for joining today. What we're going to cover today, after we finish this workshop overview, is we're going to start with an introduction to CoSMoS overall before diving into a little bit more about the groundwater modeling and interpretation. We're going to hear an example of how this information and these tools were used in California, and then we're going to get a live demonstration of the tool itself. Before actually letting you all try out the Hera tool, set you loose on Hera so that you can try it for yourself. We've got an activity plan for you in breakout sessions, and then we'll all come back to wrap up, talk about future CoSMoS products, and share some online resources before hopefully getting you out of here right on time at 11:30. If you are a member of the American Planning Association, the APA, we do have credits available. This event will offer 2.5 credits. This information will also be shared following the workshop, but just know if you do need these continuing education credits, we are offering them. So hopefully at least a few folks can make use of that. And before we go any further, just want to share a few ground rules for the workshop. We ask that everyone be present and participate actively. I know it's hard, but please try to close your email if you can. Please be respectful of folks' differing viewpoints and experiences. I know we're all coming today from a variety of backgrounds. We encourage you to use welcoming and inclusive language when you share in the chat or in the breakout rooms, and to treat everybody with respect. And also just a reminder that this is going to be a participatory learning environment. So please just be mindful of how much time you're using in the breakout sessions and in the discussions so that everyone has a chance to participate and get their questions answered. All right, let's dive in. And a reminder to please share questions that you have in the chat. We have time set aside for Q&A with each of the speakers after they go, and some additional Q&A at the end. So please share those questions in the chat, and I'll pass it to Rebecca to introduce our first speaker.
All right, thank you, Sydney. So our first speaker is Dr. Patrick Barnard, and he's been a research geologist with the USGS Pacific Coastal and Marine Science Center in Santa Cruz, California, since 2003. He's the project chief for the Coastal Climate Impacts Project for the last decade, and the co-developer of the Coastal Storm Modeling System, also known as CoSMoS. His research focuses on coastal hazards driven by storms and sea level rise across U.S. beaches and estuaries. Patrick serves on numerous regional, national, and international scientific review panels related to climate change and coastal hazards, and has advised members of the U.S. Congress and Cabinet. He was an author for the Coastal Effects chapter of the 5th National Climate Assessment, and currently co-chairs the Scientific Task Force to update California's sea level rise guidance.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Yes, this is an effort that we've been developing for about 15 years now, the Coastal Storm Modeling System, or CoSMoS. And Patrick Barnard. I'm based out of our Santa Cruz office, but I've been up in the Seattle area now for about 4 years, in part to help build out this modeling system for the state of Washington. I'm one of many people working on this effort and many other agency partners as well. The primary partner being Washington Sea Grant, who's partnering us on the outreach side, but substantial and significant support from EPA, which really made this effort happen across the entire region. But lots of other smaller projects and partnerships with King County and Pierce County and many of the tribes in the region, and technical partners at Deltaris, and as well as Western Washington and University of Washington. So lots and lots of folks involved in this effort, and really happy to be able to talk about it with you today. So just to kind of center us here and why we're concerned, not just about groundwater hazards, but about the suite of hazards related to sea level rise, is that globally, estimates are about 300 million people and $14 trillion in assets could be exposed to sea level rise and storm-driven hazards by the end of the century. And sea level rise has tripled over the last century. So we're currently a little bit over 4 millimeters per year. So it is rising, it is accelerating. We expect it to accelerate significantly more over the coming decades. The latest guidance from the Federal Interagency Task Force puts us, right around about 3 feet by the end of the century, depending on which emissions trajectory we take, but that's probably the best estimate right now. And what this actually means for the bottom line is that sea level rise is going to cause the once in a lifetime coastal flooding event to occur about annually by 2050 and every single day by 2100. But storms matter. And when we've done some analysis looking at storms and coastal change in comparison to sea level rise alone, about 3 times more people would be at risk. So it's very important that we consider the dynamic nature of the ocean and the coast, and not just rising seas like a bathtub. So we've been developing a number of approaches to look at the hazards related to climate change, everywhere from the Northwest to the Southeast and other stretches of coast as well. And we've been mainly focusing on the increase in more frequent and severe coastal flooding, looking at increased rates of beach loss and bluff failures. Today, we'll be talking mostly about rising water tables, but saltwater intrusion is also a major concern. Coastal squeeze is another, as our infrastructure, our communities are squeezed between rising seas and coastal development. And also, there is a very clear and disproportionate impact on underserved communities. So these are all issues we've been trying to address through various research approaches. So the primary one we're going to talk about today is the Coastal Storm Modeling System. And this is a model for assessing hazards due to climate change. And we focus on 3 primary hazards in this approach. One is overland flooding, second, groundwater rise, and the second is coastal erosion, both beaches and bluffs, although that is mainly focused on the outer coasts where wave-driven processes dominate, although we do have a pilot effort looking at cliff retreat within the Sailor Sea that Eric Grossman is leading. The approach considers the future evolution of storm patterns based on the latest global climate models. So we're not looking at historical conditions and just applying those to the future. We do use historical conditions to train the model, but we're looking at the future evolution of climate. So we rely on GCMs for this purpose and how storms will change in the future. And the dynamic component is really the niche that we have above and beyond, say, what NOAA does. So we bring in this dynamic simulation of waves, current, storm surge, and the resulting coastal flooding. So bringing in all these compound factors that drive flooding along our shores. And as is the USGS mantra, everything that we do is extensively tested, calibrated, and validated with historical data. So it's really critical that we get the past right before we can even talk about the future. And then we include a range of sea level rise and storm scenarios, so it can support virtually any planning level, whether it's emergency response tomorrow or the most extreme sea level rise and storm condition by the end of the century or beyond. And then do this consistently across all geographies. And we're doing this now, of course, for the Sailor Sea, but it has been applied to the state of California, to the Southeast Atlantic, to the Pacific Islands, and is currently being built out in Alaska, as well as, of course, the states of Washington and Oregon. So the objectives and timeline for Puget Sound, the greater Sailor Sea area, is to provide a regional standardized process-based tool to support coastal resilience. This is a non-regulatory product, so it does not have the regulatory teeth, but we try to design it to be able to feed into regulatory frameworks. And in doing so, we need to account for all the relevant factors that affect coastal flooding at planning relevant scales, and then working with Sea Grant as our outreach partner. We have a significant amount of resources, thanks to EPA, to build regional and local awareness and capacity. So this map shows where we are now. The groundwater hazards have been built out for the entire Sailor Sea, and those are available on the street. We're going to talk a lot about that today. The Pacific Coast work will come out next year for the groundwater hazards. For the flooding hazards, the overland flooding, Whatcom has been completed. King and Pierce are next in line to be done, completed by around the middle of next year. And then the remaining interior counties of the state of Washington by the middle of 2026, and then the Pacific Coast counties into 2027. And then, as I mentioned, we also predict coastal change, and this will be completed for the Pacific Coast only. That'll be done in 26. So a little bit about how the modeling framework works. We go from the global scale. We use the wind and pressure fields from global climate models, the wind fields to develop global wave models, which are downscaled to the regional level. We're bringing all the other relevant factors that drive coastal water levels. So how basically locally generated seas, the swell propagation through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, storm surge, tides, etc. And then all this gets downscaled to the very local level, the planning level scale, where we transform these waves and water levels across the near shore, onto the shore, and into infrastructure, if that is what the model predicts. And then all this gets rolled out into a series of GIS savvy hazard maps, and then also web tools, which we're going to talk about quite a bit, where you can translate these hazard zones into exposure analytics and something relevant for planning and policy. So the core products, we have this suite of 28 different sea level rise and storm scenarios. So sea level everywhere from 0 to 10 feet. So basically any plausible scenario over the next century and into the 22nd century. And then sea level and the storm scenarios from your daily average conditions up to the 100-year return level event. So the products you get, we look at various metrics related to flooding. So the extent, uncertainty band, the minimum maximum extent, the depth, and then also predictions of wave height, flood duration, and then on the Pacific Coast shoreline change. And then as we're focusing on here today, the rising groundwater, and then all of this translated into socioeconomic exposure metrics delivered in GIS data, which can go straight into a planning process, or for easier viewing and translation into policy relevant language, web tools, in particular the hazard exposure reporting analytics tool shown here, which you're going to get a demo on soon. So instead of just looking at what can be somewhat esoteric 2D maps of flooding, we're translating all this information into socioeconomic impacts. So how many people are in these zones? What are the demographics of the residents in these zones? Roads, critical facilities, etc. There's lots and lots under the hood, which we'll get to. Another deliverable that we're working on also is augmented reality and virtual reality applications, so we can better visualize the flooding projections as we go forward. And then, as is critical in a scientific endeavor, everything has to be backed up and defended through data releases, reports, and peer-reviewed journal articles, of which we have many already supporting this work. So here's the primary interface for viewing the information. All these different modules will be available for the Pacific Coast and within the Sailor Sea, all but shoreline change. And we'll get into this even more. And so flooding, this is one web viewer we developed in California, which is very similar to what you're going to see in Washington, where you have all these different sea level rise and storm scenarios at your disposal. And folks often go in here, zoom into their area of interest and start clicking through scenarios, looking for thresholds, looking for tipping points to where flood exposure increases dramatically or gets into certain sensitive infrastructure that the community deems to be important. There's also this product of looking at wave conditions, and this can be critical for harbor safety and navigation safety for looking at how waves are penetrating, for example, through harbor breakwaters and the like. Coastal change, this is again for the Pacific coast. What you're going to get is looking at the position of the shoreline, which represents basically the beach position, and looking at how that shoreline migrates mostly landward due to sea level rise pressures and possibly into infrastructure. Lots of modeling under the hood here, which we're not going to get into today. And then the feature of today is the groundwater hazards led by Kevin. He's going to give the next talk to really dive into this, which looks at basically the position of the coastal groundwater table and the response due to sea level rise. And this is just an example from the Northern Sailor Sea. In the cool blue colors here, showing where the water table is expected to be very shallow, and in yellow where we expect it to be a bit deeper. And in this case, we see that basically the river corridors and deltas is already and in the future will be expected to have very shallow and potentially harmful coastal groundwater tables really near the surface, and sometimes daylighting at the surface. So just to wrap up with some key features and uses. So we talked about the web viewer. We spent a lot of time building capacity and doing outreach led by Maya and our partners at Sea Grant. And so in other geographies now, we've been able to interface with over 200 different agencies, mostly related to climate adaptation planning, but in some cases, emergency management planning. And a lot of this feeds into various planning processes like coastal zone management plans, hazard mitigation plans, SMPs, as you're more familiar with here in Washington, permit review, you name it. It's been used in legislatures for arguing for bond measures, and in case of California, the results of CoSMoS were leveraged and argued to help pass a $4 billion climate resilience spending package a couple of years ago. But then because we have this consistent approach, agencies with larger purview, whether they're federal or state, the former like National Park Service or DOD or state DOTs, all of these have a common operational picture where they're trying to allocate resources across very large regions. And so they've used this information for prioritizing mitigation adaptation or their area of purview. And so just end with that. More information here, the QR code on the USGS side. Primary contacts are myself and Maya, and happy to answer any questions, or we can move on to Kevin. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Patrick. If there are any questions, we do have a little bit of time, so please go ahead and share those questions in the chat. We'll give it a couple seconds for folks to share their questions. All right, well, we've got one. I thought I heard Patrick say that while this model is not tied to regulations, it could feed into regulatory frameworks. Can you be specific as to which set of regulations this is expected to tie into? For instance, can the outputs integrate with FEMA coastal flood models?
It's a good question. Yeah, we've been trying to work with FEMA on the national level for a while, and I think that's still a work in progress. It's more been tied into state level regulatory efforts. And that is if there are specific metrics or thresholds that state regulatory agencies or county or city or what have you deem to be important, then we've customized the products to be able to feed right into that process. So for example, the California Coastal Commission uses this for permit evaluations for development permits that are put into the state. And so we've basically established these set of sea level rise scenarios, which directly line up with the California state guidance. And so they can then relate that to their regulatory authority within the state of California. And the intention is to do similar things within the state of Washington and working with our partners at Sea Grant and their network of partners to better understand the regulatory needs across the region and then customize the products so they can directly support your planning needs in that framework.
Excellent. Thanks, Patrick. And then we've got two additional questions. What is the landward geographic extent of the groundwater model for the Salish Sea?
Yeah, it's a great question, and Kevin's going to get into that a bit more. But generally, it's up into the influence of sea level rise related to the response to the water table. Typically, we look up into about the 10-meter elevation contour where the results are the most relevant. Because of model boundary conditions, we go in further, but it's mainly looking at those lower elevations along the entire Salish Sea.
And folks will have a chance to play around in Hera and see for themselves later what that extent is. Can you reconfirm the timing on the rollout of the availability of this model in Washington? And maybe, Patrick, you could specify the groundwater products versus the other products.
Yeah, sure. The groundwater model is available everywhere in the Salish Sea now. The outer coast will be completed by the end of next year for the groundwater hazards. And then for the flooding side, Whatcom is out now, so there's a good example of what you're going to get there for the rest of the Salish Sea, which would be completed for Pierce and King the middle of 2025, and the other Salish Sea counties the middle of 2026, and then the Pacific Coast about the year after that.
Is the model available for all of California at this point?
Yes, it is.
And does the model include data on whether the land is rising or falling? So vertical land movement here in Washington.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, we do assess vertical land motion from INSAR for the last about 12 to 15 years, and that's included on the back end and the uncertainty because we don't know the nature of those rates because it's such a short record. We'd like to ideally apply that on the front end of the modeling, that is adjust the land before when we do the flood modeling, but because it's such a short record, we include that in the uncertainty band. And so we have that for all, and that data is soon to be available for all of the Salish Sea and the outer coasts of Washington and Oregon, as it is for the state of California for the coastal zone.
Excellent. And then time for one more question. So when both the overland flood modeling and the groundwater modeling are available for a location, will you be able to view these hazards together?
Yeah, they're all viewable through that Hera tool in different modules. You could view them together through a GIS. You can download all the various shape files and look at them together, but for viewing purposes, they're in these separate modules. They're a little bit difficult to view together. It gets a bit messy. So that was sort of the strategy for the public viewer for that.
Awesome. Thanks, Patrick. We're going to have to move on. If you would like to respond to any of the additional questions in chat, you're welcome to, but we also are holding some time after all of the speakers go, so we could come back to any questions that you'd like to answer verbally. And with that, I'll pass it to Rebecca to introduce Kevin.
All right, thank you. So Dr. Kevin Beefus is an assistant professor in the Department of Geosciences at the University of Arkansas. Dr. Beefus began his faculty career in the Department of Civil and Architectural Engineering at the University of Wyoming. Dr. Beefus was a Mendenhall postdoctoral fellow at the U.S. Geological Woods Hole Survey Coastal and Marine Science Center. The academic path to these positions started at Wheaton College in Illinois, followed by an MS in Geological Sciences at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and a PhD in Geological Sciences at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Beefus studies a wide range of hydrologic problems focused on how groundwater systems interact with changes at and near the land surface, ranging from the coast to mountainous continental interiors and extending as far back as the last glacial maximum. Kevin.
All right, thank you. Hopefully you can see my slides.
Looks good.
Great. All right, thank you. So I'm going to be presenting today on why you should care about shallow groundwater and explain a little bit about how sea level rise is connected to groundwater and the hazards that we can start to identify with these groundwater data sets. And so I've been the modeler on this team. and helping produce some of these data sets that you'll get to look at on the web viewer here in a little bit. So, sure I can click. All right, so I like to start off by talking and reminding us all about the many dynamics that happen at the coast. And today we're interested in the hydrologic dynamics. And so this is probably our standard idea of what are all of these changing water levels in the coast. We have tides, we have sea level rise, and of course we have changes to the landscape as well. Here you see that the water level is rising, and that leads to some erosion potentially of the shallow coastline. We also see that there's an ecosystem change where the wetlands here are migrating upwards a little bit. But something that isn't very well explained or shown in this animation is why these trees are dying. And so the focus today is trying to understand what some of the more inland effects of sea level rise are, specifically with pathways that are happening underground. And so what could be happening is that a storm came in and deposited some salt that got into the roots and killed the trees. But another mechanism for these trees to be dying is actually that the shallow groundwater table, and so the water that's underground is actually rising enough to the point where it's drowning out the roots. And so those roots don't have access to enough oxygen anymore. And so that can actually be happening before we see any evidence of this sort of change at the land surface. And so this is that groundwater rise happening with sea level rise, potentially. And so what this looks like in another diagram is that under the ground, if we were to drill a well from the land surface down, we would eventually hit water. And so this is what we would call the groundwater table. And in the most direct way, this is where we go from having openings in the ground that have some air in them to where they're fully saturated with water. And so the water table, or the groundwater table, is this transition from where we have some voids with air in them to basically all the voids are completely full of water. And also technically that is at atmospheric pressure, because it's hard to define that line otherwise. And so what you'll see in this diagram is that the groundwater table, it slopes a little bit downward towards the coast. And right at the coastline, if we were able to zoom in here, we would see that groundwater table is completely connected to sea level. And so sea level is really setting the lowest boundary that the water table can be, because water is going to flow with gravity. Water moves to the lowest spot that it can, and the same thing is happening underground. And so sea level plays a really important role for what this groundwater table is doing, especially really close to the coast. And then inland, it becomes more affected by the position of rivers and lakes, and also how much water is infiltrating and recharging into the shallowest aquifer. And so with these products that we'll be looking at today, we're most interested in the first groundwater system, the very top aquifer that, you could have multiple in depth, that you get a lot of layers in the geology. And so we're interested where we first hit water for drilling a well. The other part of this diagram is that we do have fresh groundwater and we have saline groundwater. And so we do have an interface between the fresh and salty water. There's a difference in density. And so the fresh water, floats on the salty groundwater. And so we'll be able to look at saltwater intrusion as that change in the interface actually moving inland. And this is all happening underground. And so with sea level rise, what happens is that if we were drilling a well in the same spot as before, we would actually hit the groundwater table sooner. We wouldn't have to drill as deep of a well. And so we call this groundwater rise. And so this is the sea level effect happening inland beneath our feet. At some point, we might actually have the groundwater rise enough to the point where we have what we call groundwater flooding. So it's flooding actually coming up from the ground, up from below. The other side of this is that groundwater could actually reach the land surface and then flow away. And we have a special term for that that's called groundwater emergence. It's emerging from the ground. And so I'll use that some here in the next couple slides as well. And so flooding is when it's ponded up, but sometimes it'll reach the surface and isn't stuck by the landscape, and it's able to drain away. And so that would be a place with groundwater emergence. And so we have this rise in the water table because sea level has risen. Something that you can see here as well is that, if we look at any point in this diagram, it looks like the groundwater table actually rises really far inland. And so the extent to where that happens is not really known. and it's really controlled by the landscape, by the topography. And so here we have a lake that forms because of the groundwater. But if this weren't here, if this were a river instead, this would actually be a place where the water table would be pinned to that elevation of that river. And so the water table inland of that actually wouldn't change at all with sea level rise. And so this is something where, depending on the landscape and the hydrology, the hydrogeology, what's going on underground, you can actually have changes, large changes in the groundwater table with sea level rise, or you could see no changes at all. And so when you're looking around the maps here in a little bit, you'll see that some places are changing, how the water table is changing a lot. In other places, it almost doesn't change at all relative to today, because either there isn't enough space for the water table to rise, that it rises to the point where it hits the land surface and it can't go any higher without, the water then escapes the ground. Or it's because it's gotten connected to the drainage network, to a river, a lake, or a stream. All right, the other thing here, because saltwater intrusion is also occurring at the same time, that isn't the focus today. I know it's generally probably what you think about with groundwater and sea level rise, and it is important. But this is primarily a drinking water concern. And for the most part, we don't get our drinking water from this shallower aquifer. So this does happen in the deeper aquifers, and it's something we can use these model outputs to understand, but it's not the main focus. Today's focus is actually about flooding and shallow water levels and the hazards that presents. And so this already happens today. So this is a photo from Cape Cod, Wellfleet, Massachusetts. And this is the groundwater table that has emerged at the surface. And so this is groundwater flooding. It's not a major flooding event. Golf carts can still drive through it. So this would be considered nuisance flooding. But it's there, it's water at the surface. It's affecting the operation of this business. And you can see that, we have a nice sunny day around. There might have been some rain involved, but that's still not the primary cause of this groundwater emergence or this groundwater flooding. And this water is going to be there until it can drain away. And since this is a low-lying spot without a natural drainage connection, it'll be here until the water actually flows all the way under the ground into the coast. About, in this case, it's about 1,500 feet away from this golf course. And so that distance of how far the water has to flow to make space underground is really important. So how far away you are from the coast, but also the material properties. And so is it sand or is it clay? Is it a really hard geology with really small openings, or is it one that has a lot of capacity for flow? And so that's what we're going to call the permeability. Of course, the business isn't going to be that patient for that to happen naturally, because that could take, days, weeks, months to actually happen. It could also never drain away if it's a long-term sea level rise effect. And so the main solution here is actually to pump it. And so one of the reasons I really like this photo is that you can see this nice sump pump here that's going to start draining away this flooding, especially for this the crossing here. All right, so this is already happening today in many places around the world. And so in the most part, it's a slow, long-term kind of little by little effect, that it's not this kind of dire, drastic flooding out of nowhere, but it is still a major problem. And so these are some of the problems that we've identified, some of the hazards that shallow groundwater and even increasingly shallow, so raising water levels, that the sort of hazards that they can produce. And so flooding is sort of the main one here that we think about. That groundwater can actually flood itself. But one of the other issues is that once the ground is saturated, it also doesn't allow any rainfall to infiltrate. And so if a major rainfall event comes through and the ground is already fully saturated, that actually worsens the superficial flooding. And so it's not just that groundwater is flooding itself, but it's amplifying the effect of any storm-based flooding as well, because the rivers and the networks are already fuller as well. Another thing that happens is that roads that are built for conditions that aren't supposed to be wet, but then the water table rises up into the base of that road, those roads actually crack more easily or more quickly. They fatigue more rapidly, and they have shorter lifetimes. And so the roadway expenses increase. If we come over here, basements could flood. If you have basements in those areas, that could lead to, right, the water levels coming up higher and higher into that. It also can affect French drain systems, where French drain systems maybe kind of reach capacity more quickly. one of the issues with even before the basements flood is that as the water table moves upward, it's saturating those pores with water. And so it's pushing any gases that are in the soils upward as well. And so if you have issues with radon gas or volatile organic compounds, that can also be amplified by this rising water level, by this completely underground. Also, any sort of buried pipes, sewer systems, sewer networks, septic systems, they all rely on basically not having water flow into them, that they're either keeping water in a conduit or able to drain out of a septic system. And so these are all kind of some major features, already seeing some impacts of shallow groundwater on these, especially been noted in Hawaii and on the East Coast. And then something else that's more and more of interest is how does this change in the groundwater flow and groundwater levels affect the pollution that's in the soil? And so if there's polluted soil that maybe doesn't have that water table in it yet, but then the water table rises up into that soil, it can actually remobilize those contaminants where they've kind of been stuck on the soils. And then you have the water level come up, and then it kind of frees those chemicals to move again. And so that's a major health hazard and concern of this. All right, so I am going a little bit long because I want you to really understand these kind of processes, why we care about the groundwater. This is the modeling slide. This is the sort of the main business slide that I have for you, that the goal of the groundwater modeling and producing these groundwater depth forecasts is to understand long-term groundwater tables and how they respond with sea level rise. And so these were run for many different levels of sea level rise. These were the long-term level. And so that led to 8 different sea level rise scenarios. Unfortunately, the geology that's needed for these models has to be 3-dimensional, that there are products for, various maps of the geology, but they don't have the full 3D structure that would be needed for these. And so we did some uncertainty analysis with different permeabilities, how easy it is for water to flow. And so we have 3 different products for that. In my modeling, I actually used several different areas, but then I merged them into a seamless product. And so in the end, there's 24 different scenarios that include those 8 sea level rise scenarios and 3 geologies. The idea of the long-term water levels is that the model is trying to capture the average over about a decade, roughly, that groundwater levels don't change very quickly. And so if we run a model for a static average water level, that gives us a sense of where the groundwater is over kind of a long term. And so this is sort of the representative kind of timing of when these models might be. And so even though groundwater levels will be very dynamic, they'll change with seasons, they'll change with tides sometimes, they'll change even in response to storms, that this model is really trying to understand that long-term change and the response of those water levels to sea level rise. With these geologies, it's sometimes hard to choose which one of those to do. The default on the viewer is probably your best bet, that the moderate one is based on calibrated values at the national level. But if you know more about the geology of where you are, and that you have more records of where the groundwater levels are, then you can choose maybe one of these other scenarios that best fits your more local knowledge. And then also there's a risk tolerance that you can go with this, that the less permeable option is much more conservative from a risk perspective. It has lower risk tolerance, and it's because the water levels are much higher. There's much more likelihood for there to be groundwater hazards versus the more permeable one. And so based on what sort of assets you're talking about, you might be able to pick one of these geologies or another. So just my final sort of slide here is using this diagram again, that we're going to be looking at maps, and maps don't have this 3-dimensional piece to them. And so this is the color scheme that you're going to see on those maps. And these different colors represent how deep you'd have to drill a well to hit that water table. And so if we were to look at these maps, these colors correspond to these sort of different conditions, where the browns are generally a deeper water table, and then the blue and the yellow are much, much shallower water tables. So I just wanted to put this in your heads before we started going into the viewer, but also we get to hear about how these data have been used in California first. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I think we are going to encourage folks to put questions in the chat, but let's hold them for now. I'm really glad, Kevin, that you were able to give that in-depth explanation because I think that'll really help folks understand what they're seeing in HERA. So folks, if you have questions for Kevin, please put them in the chat. But for now, I'd like to pass it to Rebecca and she'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker, Katie.
All right, thank you. Katie Fallon is an environmental scientist on the Adapting to Rising Tides team in the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission. Born and raised in Seattle, Katie received a Master's of City and Regional Planning from University of California, Berkeley, and has previously worked for the New York City government in maritime and waterfront planning. She's an expert in GIS and passionate about creating equitable and adaptive shorelines that work for both people and the environment.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Oh, gotta switch it.
It looks good, actually, Katie.
Oh, it does? Okay, never mind. All right. Hi, all. My name is Katie Fallon, and I'm an environmental scientist, as was just stated, on the Adapting to Rising Tides team at the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, or BCDC for short. Before I get into how we use the CoSMoS data, I want to give you some short background on BCDC and the San Francisco Bay more generally. So unlike the Puget Sound, the San Francisco Bay is a very shallow body of water. It is on average only 18 feet deep. Due to its shallow nature, starting in the second half of the 19th century, developers saw the bay as a solution to the area's growing population. And by 1965, the year BCDC was founded, the bay was a third smaller than it had been 100 years earlier. So this map on the right shows the original shoreline of San Francisco Bay, San Francisco, with the areas built on fill added in pink. This rapid and unregulated filling of the bay, which showed no signs of slowing, is what led to the creation of BCDC. So BCDC is a California state agency with regulatory authority over the San Francisco Bay and its shoreline. BCDC is comprised of a 27-member commission with local, regional, and federal representatives and a staff of about 60. The mission of BCDC is to protect and enhance the San Francisco Bay and encourage the bay's responsible and productive uses for this and future generations. BCDC was the first coastal planning and regulatory agency in the world. When it was founded, the Bay Plan and the McAteer-Petras Act, the founding documents of BCDC, gave the commission two main charges. The first was to regulate unnecessary fill of the bay, and the second was to expand public access along the bayshore. At the time, there's only 5 miles of public access along the bay. While these are still core to the agency's mission, the goals of the agency have since expanded. In 2011, the Bay Plan was amended to include climate change policies, and a year later, the Adapting to Rising Tides program was created. Since then, helping prepare the Bay Area for sea level rise and other related hazards, such as groundwater rise, has been a major tenet of our work. BCDC's role in sea level rise adaptation planning was expanded even further last year when the state legislature passed SB 272, which requires jurisdictions around the bay to create sea level rise resiliency plans and submit them to BCDC for review and approval. In accordance with SB 272, BCDC has been creating sea level rise adaptation planning guidelines called the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan, or RSAP, for jurisdictions to follow. Projects that are submitted through the RSAP will have access to prioritized adaptation funding. As part of this, BCDC is developing a technical assistance program that includes the creation of an online mapping platform, which I'll get into more now. So the online mapping platform will act as a data and visualization resource, in many ways similar to our CoStar Future, for jurisdictions when creating their sea level rise resiliency plans. Local jurisdictions will be able to download spatial data on the extent of shoreline hazards that exist in their jurisdiction, some of which are listed here. The platform will also have info on the location of critical infrastructure, socially vulnerable communities, contaminated sites, and many other data sets that city can use to better understand what assets are vulnerable to what hazards at what future scenarios. While many of these hazards are optional for jurisdictions to include in their sea level rise plans, the first three, which are bolded, are required, and this is where our analysis of the CoSMoS data comes in. We wanted to easily communicate to jurisdictions where the shorelines are facing risks from multiple hazards at certain sea level rise scenarios. So where areas are at risk for both sea level rise and groundwater, both groundwater and storm surge, etc. Before we dive into the analysis, I want to mention that our guidelines aren't completely finalized. We are about to release a draft for public comment, and our methods are subject to change. So for the online mapping platform, we created 4 combined hazard maps based on sea level rise scenarios from the 2024 Ocean Protection California Sea Level Rise Guidance. The OPC guidance is based on the latest climate science as well as local knowledge about the California shoreline and is used to inform adaptation planning in the state. It's important to note that we use 2 main sources of data for our combined hazard maps, and they do not always perfectly line up with each other or the state sea level rise guidance. We use BCDC's Adapting to Rising Tides maps for our sea level rise and storm surge data, and the USGS CoSMoS data for groundwater. While CoSMoS also has sea level rise maps available for use, we decided to use an existing sea level rise model that we use locally. We did an analysis to compare the ART data to the CoSMoS data, and while each have points of accuracy over the other, the ART data does a better job incorporating local flood management data, which was very important to local jurisdictions to include. However, we have and will continue to use the CoSMoS sea level rise data when it better suits our needs. Using 2 different data sets created some disparities with what sea level rise or groundwater levels were available and how they compared to the OPC guidance. In general, we chose the respective values closest to the state guidance. These values were never greater than half a foot different from each other or the associated OPC guidance scenario. To calculate the 100-year storm surge value, we added approximately 3.5 feet to the sea level rise value for each scenario. This reflects research that was done by AECOM in the 2016 Tidal Datums and Extreme Tide Study for the San Francisco Bay. Well, these are the values determined for the SF Bay. Storm surge amounts for the Puget Sound may look different. Now I'm going to get more into the nitty-gritty of how we analyze the CoSMoS data. So similar to what Kevin just described, after extensive analysis and discussion about which CoSMoS groundwater model to use, we decided to use KH=1 or the moderate subsurface hydraulic connectivity model. Our region has highly variable geology, so we figured moderate hydraulic connectivity would minimize maximum error. We also compared the CoSMoS data to the more local models that don't cover the entire region, and the moderate connectivity seemed to be the most similar. Once we had chosen which hydraulic connectivity model to use, we downloaded all the data from our CoStar Future and loaded it into ArcGIS Pro. Because we were working with 9 counties worth of CoSMoS data and 4 hazard scenarios, this entire process was done through the Python extension in ArcPro or ArcPy. This allowed us to automate the creation of the combined hazard maps, which saved us a lot of time. Although shallow groundwater is largely considered to be anything shallower than 2 meters, we decided to include data up to 9 feet, as research from Professor Christina Hill at Berkeley shows that shallower than 9 feet is when underground utilities begin to be affected and underground contaminants start to mobilize. This second one is a critical environmental justice issue in the Bay, so it's something we really wanted to make sure we included. For this reason, we recategorized the data into 5 depth classifications: emergent groundwater, or groundwater that has reached the surface. I've learned from Kevin, maybe we should call it emergent/flooding groundwater. Very shallow groundwater, 0 to 3 feet below the surface, shallow groundwater, 3 to 6 feet below the surface, and moderately shallow groundwater, 6 to 9 feet below the surface. And finally, not shallow, which was areas deeper than 9 feet. Sorry. Once we had reclassified the data and converted the rasters to vectors and deleted the not shallow areas of the data, we combined the analysis into one larger Bay Area layer, because before that it was separated by counties. While the previous steps told us where groundwater was shallow at the specified scenario, it did not tell us how much groundwater levels are modeled to change from current conditions. which is what we're really interested in. To better understand this, we calculated the difference in groundwater between baseline conditions and each modeled scenario using the raster calculator. Once the difference rasters had been created, we reclassified the data into two bins: areas where groundwater had changed by less than 4 inches from baseline conditions, and areas where groundwater had changed by more than 4 inches. Once the data was reclassified, we overlaid it with our previous analysis and deleted areas where the groundwater table had not changed more than 4 inches with the given sea level rise scenario. Finally, we set an outer bound on the data by cutting off where the groundwater table is greater than 10 meters below the surface. Most of this had already been done by CoSMoS, but we just did it as a final gut check. These follow methods developed by Professor Hill and better reflect areas at risk of groundwater due to sea level rise. Finally, it is important to note that we only included groundwater rise data for the sea level rise scenarios and not for the added storm surge water levels. This is due to a lack of scientific consensus on how acutely storm surge affects groundwater, as well as a lot of variability with different geology types, and how if the effects of storm surge on groundwater diminish as you move inland, and variation in how quickly groundwater returns to pre-storm depths. Once the groundwater layers were completed, we combined the CoSMoS data with the ART sea level rise and storm surge data. This analysis left us with 10 possible combined hazard categories that are listed here. In all areas where sea level rise or tidal inundation was modeled, emergent groundwater was also present. And so on the right here, you can see just a little bit of the code that we used. So finally, here are the three of the 4 combined hazard maps that we created with the different categories included. The far left is 1 foot of sea level rise, the middle is 3.1 feet of sea level rise, while the far right is 6.6 feet of sea level rise. Of particular interest is the fact that there are many areas where emergent groundwater will be a threat before sea level rise, which is something that we feel like our jurisdictions are not thinking about. While these maps will be made publicly available, I'm also working on getting the Python code into GitHub. Once the data is in the repository, we are happy to share it with anyone who would be interested and might find it useful for building off their own analysis. These slides just give a zoomed in look at the South Bay to see how the combined hazards change across the scenarios. Foster City in the top left corner is a good example of the threat of groundwater. The city is currently working on updating their levee system, but groundwater will become an issue before sea level rise, and the levees will not keep the groundwater out. This is something they're really trying to get cities to grapple with as they create their resiliency plan. So here's just like a nice back and forth of the of the change. Finally, I have some challenges and lessons learned from this project, most of which I've already talked about throughout this presentation, but it'll be good to reiterate. Using 2 different data sets with slightly different scenarios caused some issues around precision and how to communicate the scenarios to audiences. We decided to use the state guidance numbers, and those are the ones jurisdictions are the most used to seeing. Next, there were some limitations of applying a large model to a smaller region, i.e. there were a few areas labeled as shallow ground where we knew the topography of the area made that unlikely. In general, the data set was such a great resource, but recommend doing a little bit of ground truthing because ultimately you know your area better, likely. Next, we would have loved to include groundwater rise from storm surge, but viewed the analysis as too fraught. So not enough scientific backing. Hopefully in the future, we will be able to add this to our analysis. And then these next 2 are a little more technical. I did most of this analysis connecting from a remote folder over a VPN, and it really reduced processing speed. So they are big files, but if you have the space, I highly recommend storing the data locally. And then finally, we use Python to make these maps. If you are working with large data sets that require complex analysis, I highly recommend using a script. It made the process so much easier for me. All right, that is the end. Thanks so much for listening. This is my contact information in case you want to get in touch. Feel free to also email me if you want access to the code we used. I think we might have a few moments for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katie. We do in fact have a few minutes for questions, so please go ahead and drop those in the chat. And while we wait for some questions, this is just a good reminder that this presentation is being recorded and we are going to share the slides on the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group website. you all will get a reminder about that and a link to that website. So if you didn't have a chance to capture contact information or you want to check something out again, you will be able to see that shortly in the next couple days once I get it up there. So let's see, any questions for Katie? Excellent. We've got our first question. Katie, can you share some initial thoughts on how local jurisdictions are grappling with these data sets? Are any jurisdictions thinking about regulating with these data or just using the data for planning?
Yeah, so this project is based around planning for sea level rise. However, BCDC is also a regulatory agency, and so we have regulatory authority over the bay. And so when on a project level, if you submit a project to BCDC, you have to talk about the hazards and how you are going to plan for them or how you're going to adjust your project. So not at the jurisdiction level, but at the project level around the bay, that's required. So if you submit a project to BCDC, you have to say, how is it going to be resilient to 2050 or the lifespan of the project? And then also we're trying to get guidance around groundwater as well. Right now that's just for sea level rise, but we try to encourage jurisdictions to also include groundwater in their analysis.
Thanks, Katie. I think we'll give it another minute. I think we have until 10 o'clock. So if anyone else has any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat now, or we can come back to them with the additional Q&A after our final presenter. So I'll give it a few more seconds. Need some Jeopardy music or something playing in the background. I'm not seeing anything, so let's move on to our next speaker. But again, please feel free to share your questions in the chat. Thank you so much, Katie, and I'll kick it back to Rebecca.
All right, thank you, Katie. Our next speaker is Maya Hayden. She is an environmental scientist and director of outreach and engagement for the USGS Pacific Coastal and Marine Science Center in Santa Cruz, California. Her primary role is as a bridge between USGS coastal hazard science and decision-making audiences. She develops and leads collaborative, interdisciplinary stakeholder engagement efforts to ensure that USGS coastal hazard science is actionable and centered on the needs of end users. She has extensive experience building capacity to plan for and adapt to climate-driven coastal hazards. She holds a PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from the University of California at Berkeley, and an MS in biology from Stanford University.
Thanks, Rebecca. I also, before we get started, wanted to introduce Kevin Henry. So Kevin, if you just come on video. Kevin Henry is a geographer with the USGS Western Geographic Science Center and is one of the lead developers for the HERA tool. And he's going to be helping me out with answering questions. And then also during our interactive activity, if people have questions about the HERA tool, he'll be floating around there as well. Thanks, Kevin. All right. So I am going to give an overview and a demo of the hazard exposure reporting and analytics tool that we call HERA. So this tool is, it incorporates the groundwater hazard information that comes from Kevin's modeling, so that, depths to the shallow coastal groundwater table and how that groundwater table changes with rising seas. So one of the main use cases for HERA is just to really be able to quickly and easily visualize the hazard maps that come out of Kevin's modeling. And then in addition, the HERA tool provides analytics to understand the exposure of a variety of assets to these hazard zones. So Patrick gave a little preview of that, right? How many people, how many miles of roads, how many schools might be within these groundwater hazard zones. And the information is sort of summarized at the census designated place unit. So that's typically like, a jurisdiction, a city, a town, and then also aggregated up to the county scale. So one thing I'll just note is that the tool you need to be using the Chrome or Edge browser or Safari, I think it also works in, but it does not currently function in Firefox, the Firefox browser. So as Patrick mentioned, there are 4 tools that are part of the HERA platform, and today we're really just going to focus on coastal groundwater. So I'm going to launch that. And on the left side is the control panel. So this is where you're going to select your geography of interest, where you can select what sea level rise scenario you're interested in looking at. And you can also convert this into feet, which I'll go ahead and do right now. As well as those different groundwater kind of permeability options. And then at the bottom, you choose your asset of interest if you're interested in looking at those exposure metrics. The main feature then that you'll see as a default is the map component, which functions just like any sort of online Google map. You can zoom in and out with your mouse scrolly thing. There's a legend that you can also minimize here and maximize back up. And then there's a few tools over here, including you can zoom in and out here, a couple other functionality that I'll talk about in a minute. But the main thing is you can also change the underlying base map. So you can change it to a satellite or a street view. So I'm going to jump in and I'm going to focus down here on Whatcom County. And in particular, I'm interested in looking at the city of Bellingham. So if I click on Bellingham, it's going to zoom right into that location. And I'm going to focus just on the port as an example to walk through today. So this is the port of Bellingham. And the first thing you'll notice is there's this little spinner up here. It tells me that the layers are still loading. Sometimes it takes a second. And so we'll be able to start to look at the hazard information, right? So I'll just have you focus in on this part of the port where right now this is showing most of these buildings with the groundwater is basically in that brown zone, meaning it's still pretty deep in that 6 to 16 foot depth below the ground surface. As you move up in these colors, so the sort of orange into the yellow zones are that very shallow groundwater, right? Indicating that the water table is potentially at or just a few feet below the surface. And then these blue areas are places where you might already have water at the surface. And then the dark blue is the Puget Sound. So I can increase the sea level rise scenarios, and then the layers will begin to load additional, the next scenario, basically. So you can see, right, that place where I was having you focus with buildings has now moved into more of that orange zone. So with a little over 3 feet of sea level rise, the water table has moved into that next shallower kind of category. And then if I bump it up to 6, a little 6.5 feet, that building area here will hopefully, yeah, you'll see it's now moved into, there's some now yellow. So we've gone into the very shallow. And so that's right how you can start to think about kind of stepping through the different sea level rise scenarios and seeing what the potential implications are for your locations of interest. The other thing I'll just note in the legend is that you can increase or decrease the opacity of those layers. So I can be able to sort of see through what's underneath there, or if I really want to, make the colors kind of stand out and make sure I'm clear what I'm looking at, you can increase the opacity. So the next piece, let's see. Oh, the other piece I was just going to mention is this panel here and what that will do. So say that, maybe I'm not actually, I'll turn this back to 3.3 feet. Maybe I'm not actually concerned for whatever my asset of interest is. I may not be concerned about those deeper water tables. Maybe I think groundwater, is only a hazard for my asset if it's basically in that shallower than 3.3 feet zone. And so if I click on that, you'll see that basically this is going to omit the orange and the brown from the viewer here. And so that I'll only have the yellows and the blues loading, hopefully. So we'll give that a second. Sydney, we need the Jeopardy music again. And I think, yeah, I'm not sure why it's not loading. It does take a second sometimes, depending on your setup. There it goes. Okay, so now you can see, right, I don't have the brown or oranges showing up. And that's just useful, especially when you're looking at the analytic information, to be able to say, you know, what actually do you think, at what depth do you think the groundwater table becomes a hazard for your particular asset? And so you can look at it in that way. Let's see. All right, so I'm going to go back to my default settings and I'm going to move into the dashboard, into the analytics. So let's say for purposes of illustrating this, the next thing I can do, so just as a reminder, I've selected the city of Bellingham and I've selected 3.3 feet of sea level rise, and I'm just on that moderate default geology. So I can look at all kinds of different asset exposure from residents. There's economic information in here for parcel values. There's land cover information. And then there are infrastructure and critical facilities. And so I'm looking at the port. I know that rail is in particular very important, right, to move products in and out of the port. So I'm going to click on railroads. And so what you'll notice is that this dashboard pops up. And the dashboard gives you all of these kind of summary statistics about the length of railroads that are in the various groundwater hazard zones. And again, a reminder that this is summarized over the census designated place, right? And so if I want to zoom back out, I can toggle on the place boundary, this little brown line, to just remind myself, okay, the city of Bellingham is this whole jurisdiction in brown outlined. And within the city of Bellingham, with 3 feet of sea level rise, I've got about 2.43 miles of railroad that are in this very shallow groundwater hazard zone. And so this panel here gives you, within my particular scenario, I'm going to maximize this now over here so that we can just focus on the dashboards. So this gives you that, that kind of diagram basically of the different depth classes and how many miles of railroad are within those depth classes. The second panel lets you have just like a quick view of how that changes, how that exposure of the railroads changes across all sea level rise scenarios. And so the thing to notice with groundwater in particular is that like the total mileage, which is listed at the top, the total mileage may not change that much, but what you're seeing is that there's a shift in your assets going from some of these deeper classes, right, to into more shallower groundwater hazard zones with sea level rise. And then the rightmost panel lets you look at, well, what if I had changed the different permeability options over here? Then how does that affect my potential asset exposure risk? So you can look at that quickly. The next thing I want to do is also just notice that there's a little toggle up here that says scale. And so it defaults to place. So I'm just looking at the city of Bellingham, but if I click to county, then it will give me the summary statistics for all of Whatcom County for the railroad asset metrics. Maybe. So we'll hope that loads here in a second. And then the next thing I'm going to start talking about is how to look at multiple communities. And so I can compare multiple communities and multiple counties. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to click all of Whatcom County, and I'm going to give this a second to see if I can get this to load. Thanks for your patience. Oof. And And yeah, I'm not sure what's happening. So if we were to get this to work, there's a compare places tab. I'm gonna soldier on here because you guys will get to play with this in your breakout groups. But there's a compare places tab, and that will give you basically graphs for each individual community within Whatcom County. And so you'll be able to just with a quick glance see, which community has the highest railroad exposure risk, and also the percentage of exposure. So not just the total length in miles for railroads, for instance, but also what fraction of total railroads within that jurisdiction are potentially at risk. And then the last piece is there's a view data table, and that will allow you to actually look at the tabular information and download the results. All right, we got some excitement. So this is what I was talking about, the compare places tab. Then I've now selected all the communities within Whatcom County. And then you'll be able to sort them by, ascending or descending order. You can scroll through here, but you can see that, portions of unincorporated Whatcom have the most length of railroad miles. And then over here, just in terms of percentages of total, right, that like for unincorporated Whatcom, that's about almost 90% of the total railroad mileage within the unincorporated portions of the county that are potentially exposed. And then again, I can click on some of these. So I'm not sure that they'll load, but if I clicked on shallower than 3.3 feet, it would basically omit those orange and brown zones and just give me totals for everything shallower than 3.3 feet. And if I just wanted to look only at the yellow zones, for instance, let's say by the time groundwater is emerging from the surface, it's too late. And so I really just want to focus on that very shallow zone. I can click up here on just the 3.3. Okay. And then I can also click discrete, and you'll see that now I'm just looking at the 0 to 3 foot depth kind of hazard zone. And so that's another component. And then I mentioned you can view the data table, and over here you can download CSV files that will give you all of the metrics that you've selected, basically. What was the last pieces? Oh, the last thing I was just going to note, let's see, make that, is that there's a lot of, scroll up here, there's a lot of help information built into this. So there are these little eye icons. If you click on those, you'll get these pop-ups that show up with help information and explanatory information within the viewer itself. In addition, if you click on help, there's a tutorial that loads, and you can just take my word for it. And then if you click on the about section, there's a lot of information here, especially data and methods is where you can basically go to say, oh, well, what railroad data set did you use? You can click on data and methods and look at the information that's available there. So I guess the main thing I wanted to note is that this tool is very much a work in progress. So, we've worked with, as we've sort of expanded in geographies, and I think we've made a lot of changes kind of through the lifespan that we've had this tool, and we would really appreciate your feedback. So you're going to have opportunity now to use the tool. Please let us know what worked well for you so that we keep those features or functions or aspects of it. And then please suggest improvements that would help to either clarify the delivery of information or improve your overall user experience. That would be really appreciated. So that's part of going through this interactive activity. We'll have a survey that will come out at the end. And we just appreciate your feedback so that we can continue to improve and make this a really useful and usable product. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya. I'm going to go ahead and spotlight Kevin Henry as well. So if there are any questions he can assist with answering those. And yeah, as Maya said, you all will receive a survey. We would really appreciate your feedback. Also, during the breakout rooms, y'all are going to get a worksheet. You can jot down any opinions or observations that you have on that worksheet to share with our facilitators and note takers. And we do have a few minutes for questions just for Maya about, or Maya and Kevin, I guess, about the tool before we move to the larger Q&A. So we do have one question. Are the groundwater depth rasters available for download?
That's a great question. The hazard layers currently are, they are available as like shapefile, geospatial data, but not via the HERA tool. So you can't download the hazard information from the HERA tool directly, but there is a repository, and we'll provide a link at the end for where all of the detailed groundwater data sets live, right? And so we're visualizing really just one component of the kind of variations of outputs that Kevin has provided. And then, but yes, so it's available for download through your own kind of use and application in your GIS system.
Thanks. Next question. What has been the response from the jurisdictions in Whatcom County to this tool?
That's a great question. So part of it has not, it was very late in the game coming out for Whatcom County. And so Whatcom was really mostly using the actual GIS data for their vulnerability assessment, and has really, as far as I understand, not used the HERA tool that much yet, but we're moving into the second phase of that product. And so it'll be interesting to see. Yeah.
And maybe I'll invite Chandler to just come off mute for a second and plug an upcoming event that would maybe help answer that question even better.
Yes, I was just putting that in the chat. On September 17th at 1 o'clock, we're having a lunch and learn through the Coastal Hazards Resilience Network to hear from Whatcom County and how they used CoSMoS data for their compound flood vulnerability assessment. So I will drop a link in the chat if anyone wants to register for that event.
Thanks, Chandler. Next question from Charlotte. In places where HERA has been available longer, are you seeing more capacity at the local level to use the tool in-house to conduct or update vulnerability and risk assessments? So maybe that's a question for Maya and perhaps also a question for Katie. So I might go ahead and spotlight all our speakers. Just let's continue shifting maybe into the larger Q&A. So Maya, go ahead with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think definitely yes. One of the main uses for a lot of these these sort of online viewers has often been for jurisdictions when they're conducting their own community outreach and sort of public outreach and engagement. They're very easy to use, and you can then anybody can sort of like sort of float around and look at some of the hazard exposure projections for their neighborhood or their community of interest. So it's been used a lot for specific jurisdiction community outreach and engagement, and then a lot of communities will use it just again as sort of a quick way to look at the hazard information if they're thinking about a particular site-specific project and they want to remind themselves about what the exposure, potential exposure risk is. I would say though that in general, when people are doing detailed vulnerability assessments, they typically want to bring in their own geospatial data, right, for particular assets that HERA doesn't look at. Or they have more detailed information than the data sources that we've used in HERA. And so I would say most typically when people are doing vulnerability assessment, the kind of detailed analysis, they are actually using the geospatial hazard data in their own GIS or have hired some sort of technical consultant to support that analysis.
Katie, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else to that.
No, I think that's a pretty accurate representation. I think in the Bay Area, we are kind of not in a bad way, but there are so many different resources that have overlapping uses. And so I think between Hera or Arcos or Future, I think it is in the Bay. Yeah, okay. And the art flood maps and Eco Atlas, there's a lot of resources where people can pull data from, but then also doing their own GIS work as well. I think that's something that we're really trying to get everyone on the same page on.
Thank you. I'm going to actually unpin everybody because I feel like I can only pin a few speakers at once. So if the rest of our speakers wouldn't mind coming on video, just so we can see everybody. And then let's see. So I see that there was some discussion around levee building, and I know that some folks have been responding in the chat to this question about levees, but levees trapping water, and if that's something that folks should be concerned about. So I'm wondering if Kevin, would you mind just kind of summarizing what your response was to the question around levee building, trapping water, and if because of groundwater inundation, can levees trap even more water than they would have before?
Mm-hmm. Yep, and Katie also had a nice response there too. Yeah, so thinking in terms of the long term again, that levees are meant to keep water out, sometimes with just storms, and then that might not be where the groundwater hazard is really going to be responding to sea levels with a levee or a seawall. But when you have the long-term mean water levels start interacting with the height of that levee, that's when you start to not have the capacity for water to drain to that sea level anymore. And so that's where you would expect water to start ponding or emerging on the inland side of that levee. And so the example I gave is that the Netherlands have been doing this for hundreds of years with their windmills, their famous windmills, that was because of shallow groundwater, that because of the levees and the dikes that they built. And now they use really giant pumps to do that in a lot of canals to convey the water away. And Katie also said that the San Francisco airport is already continuously pumping to deal with the groundwater that's emerging behind their levees, I believe, right, Katie?
Yeah, and also because a lot of the Bay Area is built on fill, it's having a big issue with subsidence. So that's also adding to all these issues. Is SFO is also sinking, which is why they're rebuilding one of their. If you've ever flown into SFO, right now it's constantly delayed because they're having to rebuild a runway. But so it's definitely a growing issue, especially in areas built on fill.
Thank you. We got another question in the chat. Who or what organizations have been the champions for getting CoSMoS tools to be taken seriously in planning processes in other jurisdictions where it's been available? Has it been state agencies, NGOs, partners? If y'all could just kind of start talking about that. I know there was, this is a longer question, but who were some of the champions and how, kind of what's that history? What would people in Washington maybe need to know if they think this is a great tool and want to see it being used more broadly?
That's a great question. I think it originally started in California, and I think from the get-go, it was a real partnership with both local jurisdictions and state and federal agencies who were looking for this type of information, right? Of like thinking about how do we translate these sea level rise curves, these projections into actual kind of spatial maps on the ground, like where is potentially things going to are potentially things going to be at risk. I think what we've seen over time is that, and I'm curious about Patrick's perspective, is that that it really has been a lot of the state agencies in California that have championed the usage of the products as a resource. for planning, and because organizations like BCDC and the Coastal Commission in California, who are the two coastal zone management agencies, they provide funding. They also are regulatory. I think that's just helped in the fact that they're talking about, not just CoSMoS, because there are, in California, other resources as well, but sort of just pointing people towards those resources, and then, in some cases, I think mandating that these coastal climate hazards need to be incorporated into their jurisdictional planning, as well as in coastal development. But yeah, I don't know, Patrick, if you have other thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I mean, some of the early support actually came from NOAA. We've had a series of NOAA grants to support this because it brings in this dynamic component, which their tools aren't doing. And then a lot from the state level, like California Natural Resources Agency, Ocean Protection Council, California Coastal Commission, indirectly through other jurisdictions. The issue about a decade ago or so was that a lot of local jurisdictions were hiring consultants to do one-off studies, which then had to be evaluated by state agencies, and they didn't have the capacity to do this, dozens of times and different approaches, different models. And so they asked us to do this consistently across the whole state. So then they're working sort of apples and apples across the whole state in every single jurisdiction. So that was really, really helpful. And then when it really got embraced, also like I mentioned, by California Coastal Commission and Caltrans, that was really helpful. And we've done lots of briefings with the California Governor's Office and things like that to really try and bring it all the way through the entire sort of agency network. And I think there was a question there just about the legislature and stuff. And so we've done briefings like in Sacramento, for example, and talked to local Congress people at both the state level and federal level as well, which kind of helps get the information out there and brings in a higher profile. And I think helped to really embrace the approach, which is underpinned by lots of research and publications, of course, I think is really critical. And USGS being an independent science agency without a policy directive or policy neutral also helps, so that we're providing information just from a scientific perspective without a policy lean.
And would you say, I know Matt also at his question was getting at whether that kind of leadership at the state level will help local jurisdictions who are feeling overwhelmed, like which tool do I pick? This is one of many, many things on the menu of planning tasks that I have to tackle. Can you just talk to a little bit about how state leadership or outreach help to get those folks on board?
That's a good question. I think, what's coming out from the state are sort of pointing to multiple resources that might be available. And then I think through the work that we've done with partners on the outreach engagement side has also been around just trying to help people understand the pros and cons of different products and tools to help people kind of make those decisions. I think, ultimately, all of the resources are really useful for planning. And I think you just need to think about what are the potential within your jurisdiction, what are your real critical potential hazards, because there might be some of the products and resources might be better suited or do a better job of kind of informing your hazard planning purposes.
Yeah, and just to tack onto that, a lot of the city and county jurisdictions didn't have capacity to evaluate risk. And so we're able to provide that sort of consistently, and then they can spend their limited resources on the adaptation and planning side, where they have more capacity or they have some resources to hire consultants for design and things like that. And so it's definitely helpful when the state and we can follow along with the state sea level rise guidance and the federal sea level rise guidance and make sure that we have scenarios that directly support those. And then local jurisdictions are pointed to CoSMoS. Here's where you can get this information on evaluating risk. And then in a consistent way, which the state is very familiar with because they've been doing up and down. And then they can use their resources and grants and stuff to really take that next step into the planning phase and in the design phase for climate adaptation.
Thank you so much, everybody. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. So please come back at 10:42, and that's when we will reconvene and then head into the breakout rooms. So we will see you in 10 minutes. Thanks very much. All right, everyone, it's 10:42 according to my clock. Hopefully you all had a chance to stretch your legs, maybe refresh your coffee, or check a couple emails. But let's go ahead and reconvene. We are going to go into the breakout room activities in just a few moments. But first, wanted to reorient everyone to the activity and make sure we're all as much on the same page as possible. Though don't worry, every breakout room is going to have a facilitator, and our experts are also going to be floating between rooms to answer any questions. So breakout room instructions. In a moment, maybe Rebecca could go ahead, or someone on the helping team can go ahead and share the worksheet PDF that we're going to be using. And we encourage you to download this worksheet. It's a fillable PDF, so you can jot notes. We are not going to be collecting them. It's for your eyes only, but it would be super helpful if you can jot down any observations that you have or any suggestions, as Maya was saying, for improving the HERA tool, in addition to using the worksheet as a way to jot down your answers. Thanks, folks, for sharing the worksheet. And then we will also share a link again to the HERA tool if you have not had a chance to use it. So please use that link to open HERA and launch the coastal groundwater tool. As I said, there will be a facilitator in your room to guide you through the worksheet. And as we said, please share any questions or confusions that you have verbally or in the chat. There will be a note taker in the room to jot those down as well, because we are using this as much as an opportunity to teach you all about HERA as it is an opportunity for us to learn how this tool could be more useful to you. We're going to be in the breakout rooms until 11:10. And so if you and the rest of your room get through the worksheet, there will be some extra time hopefully available to freely explore the tool, ask additional questions, and share that feedback so we can capture it. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and let Maya just speak to any last minute HERA tips. We know that there were a couple questions about whether the tool was going to be loading. And so Maya, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a few tech tips for folks.
Yes, Kevin Henry has been working behind the scenes to improve the loading speed. So hopefully things will be functioning a little more smoothly now. One tip is that if you find that the map layers or something it aren't loading after a minute or so, I would just maybe zoom a little bit in or out to sort of refresh the map. Any other tips, Kevin, you want to share?
Tip wise, no, unfortunately, yeah, just have a little patience, especially the dashboard at the moment. We don't have a way to like hugely increase the performance. So that one doesn't time out, as Maya showed in the demonstration. It'll just keep spinning. So we might have to do some Jeopardy music in our heads. But the data will appear eventually. And yeah, yell at me if there's anything wrong, and I'll try to find something. I'll take a screenshot and put it in chat or anything. We'll figure out a way to get you the data you need to do your homework.
Thanks, Kevin.
Mm-hmm.
This is it's a good learning experience for us having all of these users at the same time. So,
and we got a report that it's working much better now. So just let the tech gremlins work themselves out. With that, I think we are ready to head into our breakout room. So it should kick you automatically into your room. If not, Cage, our tech person, will be here to help you out. So please, Cage, anything that they should know?
Nope, you should all get in automatically. Our our team of Kevins are going to be put in a breakout room to start with. They might hang there and then come back to the main room if they want to. And if you have any trouble, use that ask for help of the host. I think it's down usually in the bottom for you. There's a button there. All right, I'll open.
Good luck, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had a chance to explore HERA a little bit and get a little bit more familiar with it. In the last few minutes of the workshop, oh, sorry, Rebecca, you were supposed to welcome participants back. I'm sorry, I jumped in ahead of you. But I'll let Rebecca go ahead and reintroduce Maya and bring us all back to wrap up the workshop.
All right, I hope that was useful for everybody. It sounded like people, at least in our breakout group, did well with it and didn't stumble very much. So that was great. So we're going to bring Maya back for the last part, which is the groundwater hazards wrap up, future CoSMoS products, and online resources. So Maya, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. All right, let's get this going back up and make sure I can see you all still. Great. Well, thank you so much. I think we had success in our room and at least maybe one issue. So it was a mixed bag, which is sometimes how these things go. Thank you for helping us through that. This was a great learning experience for us as well. I just wanted to walk through a couple things and just sort of reiterate. So this is a little bit of a recap. But so the CoSMoS information has been used, as Patrick mentioned, primarily for climate adaptation, kind of more long-range planning. And so this fits into, everything from land use plans, sometimes infrastructure, capital investment plans, and then, in coastal development permit review as well. And what I'll say is, as you think about the adaptation planning process, this is just a graphic of a sort of a, standard process. CoSMoS really fits into that assessing vulnerability phase, where you're trying to understand what potential assets or natural resources or cultural resources are potentially at risk from sea level rise. And again, at this point, we'll have, today we were focused on the groundwater hazards, but we also will have that overland flooding and the shoreline change for the Pacific coast. So thinking about coastal erosion hazards. So we have a couple examples already now in Washington. Our first example is Whatcom County. And so this is, I'll put some of these links in the chat, but they have produced a nice story map that walks through their vulnerability assessment and how they used the CoSMoS flooding information. And then Katie Fallon provided us a nice example of how the groundwater information is being used by one of the coastal zone management agencies in California, BCDC. And then, other state agencies and local jurisdictions have used it for a variety of planning purposes. So just to recap, for groundwater in particular, these are, we call them the kind of the hidden hazards, right? This isn't something you're going to see on the ground surface until potentially it's already been a hazard. So I can't remember who was mentioning that. I think it was Katie saying that for some of the jurisdictions around the bay, the groundwater hazards are going to be those earlier hazards that happen at lower sea level rise before you start to see the overland flooding that starts to, overtop levees or other shoreline features. And then, so I'll pass it over to Kevin, because I think that was what I was supposed to do there anyway. So he's going to just kind of recap about some of the hazards and talk also about adaptation strategies specifically for groundwater.
I'm glad you took that slide. It was better than I could have done it. So part of this is that groundwater being shallow in coastal areas is already making the news. It's making headlines around the country and a little bit around the world. And so this is something that there's growing awareness for. And so little by little, what was hidden with the groundwater is starting to become less hidden, but it is still underground. It's still hard to really know what's going to happen. And part of the problem is that it's really slow. Groundwater is not maybe the most exciting thing that happens like a storm, and it's also not going to be the primary hazard in a lot of these cases, where the flooding, the storm surges are going to be the things that we have to plan for first. I do want to highlight that in orange here, that a new news article just came out yesterday that is trying to understand how schools are being affected by shallow groundwater. And so that was one of your activities that you just had. And so just kind of fortuitous that, you know, there are these assets in the coastal areas that are facing this shallow groundwater. Go ahead. And I also want to say that, you know, we want to do something about it, that it's not just that this exists and it's inevitable, that there are solutions to it. Unfortunately, this is the Seattle seawall here. The seawalls, for the most part, are going to protect against the surface flooding, and they will protect against storms. But over the long term, there will be groundwater feedbacks, and these seawalls can act as a dam. And so you do get groundwater rising up on the inland side of them, unless you have holes in them, in which case they maybe aren't as protective in some cases. And so there is a recent paper that my postdoc just published recently, looking at the effects. And we found that when you build a seawall, when you build something with a little bit of a footing, that you cause more groundwater flooding, and that actually reduces the amount, or increases the amount of saltwater intrusion. It reduces the protection against saltwater intrusion. And so there are these sort of hidden feedbacks that are still happening underground, and that pumping is likely going to be something that we have to deal with when we build seawalls and levees, any sort of coastal protection that's meant to keep the seawater out, but then with sea level rise, that is increasing the levels, and that increases the groundwater level.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, so just again, a recap and a reminder on the timeline. I just wanted to show this slide one more time, that the Salish Sea groundwater hazard information is available, and then the Pacific Coast groundwater hazard information, it will be coming out at the end of next year. So stay tuned for that, as well as the flood products rolling out, and the erosion hazard information for the Pacific Coast. So again, we've taken this scenario approach to provide the options to be able to think about a lot of different planning time horizons, and also to consider that, the sea level rise curves, those projections are always, the science is improving, the projections are always kind of being updated. And so these, by producing the hazard information in these kind of incremental scenarios, it's, basically, you can think about planning to the 3.3 feet of sea level potential hazards, and recognize that may happen, earlier if we're on a faster greenhouse gas emissions trajectory, or it might happen later in the century if we're able to mitigate those greenhouse gas emissions. So thinking about that. And then the products, again, what we really focused on today was rising groundwater and thinking about the socioeconomic exposure metrics. So again, just the way we deliver these information is kind of a two-parter. One is for more potentially technical end uses, which are just providing the actual GIS spatial data, and then through these more interactive web tool products. So the hazard data is available. I'll put these links in the chat. And this is what you can do then, to download and actually then do those kinds of overlays with your own site-specific or jurisdictional specific assets of interest, to do more of a custom exposure analysis, right? The things that are provided in HERA are specific to the jurisdiction scale, and just a select number of assets that are available. And a lot of people want to get into more specific details. So they will use the geospatial data that way. And then through the web tool that we just all got to play around with. So I think for us, the key is really, we're trying to make sure that we are delivering actionable science products. And for us, what that means is they have to be useful to people like you, and they also have to be usable. And so we have partnered with Washington Sea Grant to do this kind of outreach and engagement. And it really is meant to be kind of a two-way street. So please get in touch with us, Chandler Countryman at Washington Sea Grant or myself, to provide us with feedback. So, let us know what's working, what we could do a better job of in terms of how we communicate about this information, as well as how we deliver the information through tools or GIS data. And then also think about training. So today was one example. And then we're also happy to work with you to create some more relevant trainings or provide technical assistance for you and your staff in whatever agency you represent. So please reach out about those kinds of opportunities. And lastly, just wanted to say thank you so much for having us, especially to our hosts, Rebecca and Sydney, for helping to organize this, and to the SCPG. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you to our speakers and all of our facilitators and note takers. Thank you, Kaj, in particular, for assisting on the tech. And yeah, it was a big team. Many appreciations for being able to put this together today. And then lastly, I'll just leave this one up, and I'll add the tools, the online resource links here in just a second. But again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maya. I will go ahead and leave this up. I had prepared a few final slides, but I can just share them verbally because I want to make sure folks have a chance to capture this information. So as we wrap up, a reminder to take our feedback survey. Or maybe I'll ask Rebecca to post a link to our feedback survey in the chat. You will also receive an email in the next couple days with the survey link, with the AICP credit information if you're hoping to claim those credits, and also a digital certificate of participation if that is something that you need to show your boss or to get those AICP credits. So look out for that. And again, the email that you'll get in the next couple days will have the link and the information for claiming those credits. And hopefully anyone who wants to claim them knows what to do with that information. But if you're having any trouble, please reach out to me. Workshop materials and a recording are going to be posted on the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group website. Oh, Rebecca, I think that might be the editor, the edit version for the survey. If you, here, I'll just grab the survey. I have it. I've got it right here. This is the survey that we want you all to take and that you'll get in your email. Let's see, where was I? Information about all the materials and things today will be posted on the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group website. So if you want to do the worksheet again or share it with a colleague, share any of this information, that will be on the Coastal Planners website. And just want to emphasize, if you are interested in bringing a similar version of this training, maybe slightly condensed, to your colleagues, please reach out to Chandler. Her email is here in the middle of the screen, and we can get something kind of a bespoke training scheduled for you. And last but not least, I'd just like to say thank you so much for attending. If you have any questions about the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group, you can email me. My contact information is here on the screen. And let's see, Peter asked if we could send information, that information to the mailing list for this webinar, as well as having it on the Coastal Planners Group website. Yes, we can definitely do that. I will, everyone who participated today will receive a follow-up email with those links, and I'll be sharing it on the larger Shorelines list as well for the 800 something people who are on that list and who maybe couldn't participate. We also are having a second session of this workshop on September 12th for folks maybe who weren't able to participate. There's a few spots left, so if you have a colleague who you think might want to take this training, I will go ahead and put that real quick in the chat. And with that, if you don't have any more questions and you don't want to get that link, I'll just say thank you very much. Thank you for joining, and have a great rest of your day.